Rain shimmered across the shattered plains of Lunareth 6, casting electric blue reflections in the cracked armor plating of ruined dreadnoughts and collapsed towers. The planet once bore a military command citadel, now just a field of scorched ferroglass and ghost signal echoes. Kale Riven moved like a shadow through the remnants, his pulse rifle slung low boots, crunching over glass and bone. The remnants of the Battle of Virith Reach lay beneath his feet, and he felt them like phantoms clawing at the edges of memory. His HUD flickered momentarily, glitching from the residual radiation before settling on a transmission sigil encrypted high-clearance guild routed. He recognized it instantly. Only one handler still used that code, Jarek, with whom he'd shared too many black missions and too many close calls. The message was short and sterile. High risk, high reward. Royal Draxian client. Immediate extraction and personal protection. Triple pay. Kale exhaled sharply, scanning the offer again. A royal bodyguard contract was political poison usually. He'd turned down similar ones before, but something in the way the sigil pulsed told him it wasn't optional. 12 hours later, Kale stood aboard a shuttle bound for Zephyrian Prime, the throne world of the Draxian Dominion. Through the viewport, twin suns flared against the obsidian crust of the palace moon, and crystalline towers caught the light like jagged diamonds rising from volcanic glass. The palace of Viril had been carved from a mountain's heart, every chamber and spire a testament to conquest, sacrifice, and the weight of tradition. Kale adjusted the collar of his formal black armor, its high collar marked with the minimalist crest of a mercenary unaligned, and a scar beneath his eye tugged as he frowned. The Draxian were infamous for their disdain of off-worlders and humans in particular. That Princess Aurenia, viral heir to the throne, would request a human protector seemed either a desperate gamble or an intentional provocation. He was prepared for both. The arrival was ceremonial and cold. Draxian guards, towering and silver-scaled with eyes like molten mercury, stood motionless as Kyle was escorted through hallways lined with trophies of war skulls, blades, preserved enemies, and stasis glass. A throne room of polished stone opened before him, and tension buzzed in the air. A counselor's voice, laced with derision, broke the silence, questioning aloud the princess's judgment in selecting a human. He did not respond. He stood still, unreadable, until he saw her. Aurenia Virel stood not on a dais but beside a tactical table, her stance firm, one hand braced. She was slightly smaller than her kin, only 2 meters tall, but her presence filled the room. Her silver scales shimmered with a refracted sheen, and ridges of crystalline spines arced from her head like a natural crown. But the telltale hum of servos betrayed what lay beneath cybernetic reinforcements, a synthetic spinal column pulsing with faint blue light beneath her armor. She moved like a blade, not fragile, but forged, tested, tempered. The room's murmurs grew louder, the old guard shifting uncomfortably. A princess with a machine spine was an abomination to Draxian law, yet here she stood, defiant. Her golden eyes met Kael's, reading him as one might study a weapon left lying on a battlefield, its purpose clear, but its loyalties unknown. Without words, the contract was confirmed. Kael became her shadow. Their days became a rhythm of unspoken coordination. In the training arenas, Aurenia wielded weapons with mechanical precision, her spine granting her flexibility and torque, unnatural even among her kind. Kael adapted quickly, his movements drawn from human hybrid combat schools, fluid, reactive, and grounded in unpredictability. The court watched with veiled contempt, but none challenged her choice directly. Still, the threats were real. Intercepted communications, assassination whispers, hostile glances cloaked in civility. At the reception hall, beneath bioluminescent crystal canopies, dignitaries from allied systems assembled to evaluate their princess, not for diplomacy, but for marriage. Aurenia stood poised, ceremonial armor covering her spine, but not masking it. When the Varnathi ambassador and his heir arrived, their faces twisted at the sight of her enhancements. They recoiled, apologized, withdrew. And Aurenia did not flinch. She only turned slightly, her hand tightening around a silver goblet. Kael watched it all, cataloging each insult, each slight, each withdrawal, an entire culture, unable to reconcile honor with survival. On the western balcony, under a setting sun filtered through glass towers, she allowed the facade to fall. Her voice low taut, acknowledging that 15 suitors had canceled since word of her abomination spread. Kale leaned beside her, not out of protocol, but solidarity. He told her the others were cowards, that cybernetics did not erase courage, that he'd seen her train, and any warrior would be lucky to fight beside her. She studied him, then her golden eyes piercing the veneer of indifference he'd worn for years. But before any reply came, plasma cracked through the dusk. Kale tackled her sideways, a bolt of energy slicing the air where she'd stood seconds before. Smoke billowed from the garden terraces below. Assassins, camouflaged and moving with ghost-like silence, closed in from 3 flanks. With fluid motion, Arenya unsheathed a blade hidden within her formal attire. Kale drew his sidearm. Their motions synchronized not from training, but instinct. He laid down cover fire. She flanked with deadly efficiency, targeting the rear blades hissing through the humid air. They moved as one, pressing toward a service corridor she identified without hesitation. Not royal, not fragile. A warrior. In the silence of a sealed chamber, lights flickering red with emergency tones, Kale checked her for injuries. She was intact, but the reception was lost. And more importantly, someone had breached internal protocols again. As guards rushed the corridors, Kale glanced at her. She met his gaze with something new, not gratitude, not command, but a shared understanding. The game was no longer diplomacy, it was war. The days that followed the balcony attack unfolded with quiet tension and sharpened awareness. Kyle Revin shadowed Arenya Varel with a vigilance forged in war zones, his every movement calculated not for spectacle, but for containment. The palace walls, once intimidating in their grandeur, now felt like a trap, gilded corridors masking the steady encroachment of betrayal. Every corner whispered threat. Every servant's step seemed too measured. Yet within that pressure, something began to shift between protector and charge. Arenya no longer held herself as a sovereign issuing silent commands. She moved beside Kyle, not ahead of him, and his presence at her shoulder began to draw less scorn and more curiosity from the palace ranks. He noticed her training regimen intensify her strikes, honed with surgical precision, her cybernetic spine adapting more fluidly to high-velocity maneuvers. Their sessions became rituals. At dawn, the air thick with exertion and unspoken exchanges. Neither acknowledged the change, yet both moved with a kind of practiced closeness, only forged in mutual survival. She studied his technique not with contempt, but with fascination. He adapted to hers with silent respect. The court, meanwhile, tightened around them like a noose. The Council of Elders convened and reconvened under the guise of protocol, but the pressure was palpable. Delegations withdrew their candidates. Murmurs rippled behind curtains. Servants averted their eyes when passing Kyle in the halls, as though his presence alone tainted the royal line. He heard whispers of impurity and ruin. He registered them all and dismissed none. Yet it wasn't until the Aruan delegation departed in haste that the full weight of Arenya's isolation became apparent. The palace that had once sung her praises now echoed with silence, her every step watched, not as a leader in waiting, but as an anomaly. Kale noticed her posture change not in combat, but in diplomacy. The once practiced court mannerisms now carried a subtle defiance. She walked like a soldier surrounded by hostiles, head high but jaw clenched. The cybernetic harmonics along her spine pulsed faintly in low light, revealing the line between what she had been and what she had become. And still, she remained unyielding. Within this climate of suspicion, Kyle began compiling data, slowly, methodically drawing from intercepted transmissions, ghosted logs, and surveillance blind spots. His findings suggested more than negligence. There was intent. The palace's security vulnerabilities had been exploited with knowledge of Arenya's daily routines, training schedules, and spatial patterns. It wasn't random. Someone had detailed awareness of her spinal integration points, their delays, recharge intervals, and minor calibration stutters. These were not observations an outsider could make. It had to be someone close, very close. One evening, under the veil of secured archive lighting, Kyle and Arenya pored over communication logs. No words were exchanged, but the tension between them thickened with each discovered anomaly. Time-stamped data packets revealed that encrypted messages had been sent from within the palace walls to a relay hub far beyond the Dominion's jurisdiction. As Kale traced the breadcrumb trail of coordinates, Orenya moved closer, her presence unmistakable behind him, the hum of her synthetic vertebrae vibrating softly against the silence. Neither recoiled. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted. The years of protocol, of suppression, of isolated existence and battlefield loss gave way to something wordless and raw. They didn't reach for each other, not yet, but the threshold had been crossed. They were no longer merely soldier and sovereign. They were conspirators, survivors. Two beings pushed beyond the tolerance of their respective worlds, leaning into the static-filled void between them. But peace was a fleeting luxury. The archive doors burst open, cutting through the moment with surgical finality. A high-ranking advisor entered without hesitation, her gaze sharp and rehearsed. Her presence cast a long shadow, and Orenya stiffened almost imperceptibly. Kale sensed it immediately. The advisor's tone dripped with artificial calm as she summoned Orenya for yet another medical evaluation under the pretext of succession preparation. The air tightened. When she left, the silence felt scorched. Back inside the chamber, Orenya activated a security shield, the ambient noise silenced by an electromagnetic field. She moved with surgical precision as she unearthed a private diagnostic console embedded within the wall. The sequence she entered was encrypted beyond standard clearance, and what appeared on the screen was not a medical chart but a classified incident log. She stared at it for several long seconds before motioning Kyle closer. It wasn't an injury from battle at all. The official story had always claimed her spinal failure resulted from frontline damage during the Battle of Virith Reach. But the medical scans and timeline logs told a different story. The injury had occurred within the palace itself. She had been attacked in her private quarters, not by an enemy combatant, but by someone allowed within royal proximity. The trauma, the damage vectors, the weapon residue, it all pointed inward. The cybernetics were not a badge of battlefield valor. They were a cover for assassination. And then the power grid failed. A tremor ran through the floor as the room plunged into emergency lighting. The soft hum of archive servers turned to staccato alarms and red floodlights. Kyle's instincts activated instantly. He drew his weapon, motioned for cover, and swept the perimeter. Smoke began to pour from the ventilation shafts. A tactical breach was underway. Figures emerged from the corridor, armed, masked, and moving in coordinated patterns. Their armor was painted in neutral tones, their weapons modified with frequency scatterers designed to disrupt Draxian sensors. These weren't freelance assassins. These were trained operatives. Kyle engaged without hesitation, but his movements were matched, countered with professional precision. Orenya responded in kind, her cybernetic reflexes turning her into a blur of sharp angles and lethal arcs. She moved like a machine fueled by vengeance, every strike targeted, efficient, fueled by knowledge of betrayal. They fought their way through a maze of passages, reaching a secondary containment unit just as the attackers began to deploy localized EMP bursts. Kyle took a plasma graze to his shoulder, the heat searing through carbon weave and skin, but his hand stayed steady. Orenya pulled him behind a column, her fingers unexpectedly gentle as she sealed the wound with a quick spray dermal patch. For a moment, time slowed, not in romance, but in recognition. This was no longer survival for survival's sake. This was the convergence of two beings long betrayed by the systems that built them, fighting not just to live, but to expose the rot that had shaped their fate. Kale stood weapon still raised, pain flickering through his arm, but his stance unbroken. His eyes met hers. Theirs was no bond born of affection or tradition. It was formed in silence, in plasma fire, in shared truths that could no longer be ignored. He now understood why she had chosen a human. Not for sentiment, but because her own kind could no longer be trusted to see her for what she was, a warrior still breathing, still fighting, machine spine and all. And now he would be her shield, not by contract, but by conviction. The medical chamber was silent, save for the low-frequency buzz of bioscanners humming beneath the sterile floor. Elder Kath moved with measured care, his ancient form almost reverent as he inspected the interface junctions along Orenya Virel's cybernetic spine. Kyle Riven stood nearby, shoulder still bandaged from the recent assault, observing without flinching. The diagnostics were detailed, each node lighting up in shifting gradients of blue tracking impulse response. neural conductivity, and artificial organ support. One segment pulsed unevenly. Kath paused, magnified the projection, and spoke with unsettling gravity. Had the blast struck this exact juncture during the attack, it would have rendered the entire spinal system catastrophically inoperable. Not accidental, not clumsy, precise. The same precision as her original injury. The implication hung unspoken. Aurania processed the data without outward reaction, but Kyle could sense her breathing shift. The biological rhythm of her systems elevated slightly. Anger masked beneath focus. There were perhaps only 4 individuals with access to the exact schematics of her implant system. One of them was Lord Merrick Thorne, her cousin and current contender for the throne should she be deemed unfit. She said his name without hesitation, not as a theory, but a recognition. Kale noted it. The pattern matched. The financial trails he'd unearthed earlier all circled back to the same ghost account network buried under 3 planetary proxies and firewalled by corporate shells. But they all originated from a node linked to Thorne's personal treasury council. The succession ceremony now loomed like a sword suspended over both of them. According to the ancient laws of Draxian inheritance, the heir had a limited number of cycles to secure a union that reinforced bloodline continuity. Failure to do so would allow challengers to invoke the right of supersession, a ceremonial battle and legal proceeding to determine the next ruler. Thorne, aware of the princess's social exile and mechanical stigma, had calculated his moves with surgical cruelty. No noble house would offer a suitor. Not one would bind their lineage to what they saw as a corrupted vessel. Kale spent the next cycle with Aurania deep in the palace's archaic vaults, the place where bloodlines and battles were archived, where strategy was carved into stone as much as memory. Together, they sifted through succession codices and legal lineages long abandoned. The air was thick with dust and past betrayals. They're embedded in an encrypted protocol under the Third Galactic War Treaties. They found it an obscure clause never formally revoked. In times of political fracture or succession crisis, an heir could invoke unified alliance by combat, a precedent that permitted a non-traditional consort to participate in trials of worthiness. The requirement was not bloodline purity, but demonstrated valor, loyalty, and strategic acumen. There was a silence when they read it. It was legal, it was ancient, and it had not been tested in generations. The clause could be challenged, but it could not be dismissed. Kale didn't ask for her opinion. He knew what it meant. He knew the cost. To stand for her would make him a target from all sides, viewed as an aberration, an affront to ancient law, and an interloper in the eyes of every Draxian traditionalist. But he also knew there was no other candidate who could protect her, let alone match her resolve. The decision was already forming before the alarm sounded again. This time it wasn't a clean incursion or assassination attempt. It was a purge. Palace guards flooded the lower chambers without warning, led not by masked infiltrators, but by advisor Lysen herself. Her tone was colder than the reinforced alloy corridors, her words precise as she ordered their separation. She declared that Kyle's continued proximity to the heir jeopardized the sanctity of the royal succession. She invoked Clause F7 under Dominion law, stating that any influence deemed contaminating to the genetic legacy of the line could be neutralized pending investigation. The guards followed orders with brutal efficiency. Kyle was restrained and dragged to a subterranean isolation unit, one designed for political dissidents and species of inferior classification. The room was sterile hexagonal, its walls designed to erase the concept of time or perspective. Kyle sat motionless, mind racing, not in panic, but in patterns. Every detail, every betrayal, every coded glance replayed with algorithmic clarity. They weren't simply trying to delay him. They were preparing to eliminate her candidacy entirely by removing the only variable she still had trust. Elsewhere, Aurania paced behind a veil of reinforced energy bars, her internal systems recharging at partial capacity, her spine humming with frustration and cold logic. Her private comm channel sparked with interference as she tried to access the encrypted lines Kale had built for them. After several failed attempts, a static-laced voice pierced through Kale's sharp but contained promising he would not be sidelined. She responded with only a breath, the exhale of someone no longer content to be silent in a chamber of old rules. That night, Kale received an unexpected visitor. A palace guard face, partially obscured, entered the cell with calculated caution. He identified himself only by sigil one known to Kale from an older contract that involved a Draxian diplomat and an off-world insurgency. The guard revealed his allegiance to an underground faction within the palace, one that had grown disillusioned with Thorn's manipulations and the systemic hypocrisy of genetic elitism. They had seen Orenia bleed. They had seen Kyle fight. They had seen enough to question the foundations of their doctrine. The escape was swift and silent. Kyle moved through maintenance corridors as though retracing scars, each passage a memory of other wars, other collapses. Along the way, he accessed a data uplink, feeding in the files he and Orenia had uncovered financial transfers, tampering records from the trial systems, and assassination route protocols. Each packet was encrypted and queued to broadcast if his life sign ceased. It was his insurance policy. It was also his promise to her. At the same time, Orenia enacted her own escape. With the help of a handful of loyalists, once palace guards, now revolutionaries, she dismantled the failsafes of her containment unit. The sound of the energy bars collapsing echoed not as rebellion, but revelation. Her first order was clear: find KL. The second, confront Thorn before the right of supersession could be invoked. As they converged in the heart of the palace's understructure, they saw each other through the smoke of sabotage and collapsing hierarchy. No embrace, no fanfare, only a shared nod deeper than ceremony. They were no longer protector and heir. They were anomaly and threat. They were heresy and hope. Together they moved upward, toward the chamber of law, toward the blood-soaked dais, toward the final challenge, one that would not be won with words, but with truth forged in fire. The dawn over Zephyrian Prime broke not with warmth, but with metallic stillness. The sky carried no color, only reflections from the towering spires that lanced upward like blades waiting to fall. In the center of the ceremonial training grounds, an arena carved from ancient crystal and alloy, Kyle Riven stood in solitary readiness. His armor bore no crest, his body no augmentation, yet his presence disrupted the air like a storm held in stasis. Opposite him stood the first of many opponents, Draxian warriors bred for dominance, combatants whose lineage was their birthright, whose every motion had been refined by centuries of ritualized conflict. This was Trial 1, the gauntlet of combat. And Kyle was alone. Above him, in a high chamber overlooking the arena, Orenia Varel watched from behind translucent shielding, her pulse steady despite the raw ache beneath her skin. The weight of her decision to invoke the ancient clause and place her trust in an outsider reverberated through the council halls like tectonic pressure threatening to rupture tradition. Yet, as she observed, Kyle move, dodge, strike, not with brute strength, but with predictive flow, adaptive responses, unorthodox timing. She felt something deeper than vindication. She felt prophecy. The trial was brutal in form, but elegant in intention. Each warrior attacked not in chaos, but with strategic patterning, a display of martial philosophy as much as physical domination. Kyle responded not with mimicry, but with disruption. He fractured their assumptions, sidestepped the expected, inverted their momentum. He suffered blows, yes, deep lacerations, concussive trauma, but never wavered. The arena, so often a stage for legacy, became instead a crucible of reinvention. Between rounds, Orenia descended to the arena's threshold, her armor reflecting the broken light. There was no audience gesture, no spoken strategy, but her presence alone recalibrated KL's center. He moved as though tethered not by duty, but resonance. The trials continued. Agility challenges through kinetic walls and shifting gravity corridors, memory tests embedded within simulated combat environments. Kyle survived them all not by matching Draxian physicality, but by transcending the framework itself. Where others relied on muscle memory, he applied prediction. Where others attacked from tradition, he countered with evolution. Behind the spectacle, sabotage crept. Lord Merrick Thorn, cloaked in ceremonial armor and false composure, activated contingency measures buried within the arena systems. Phase distorters triggered erratic energy fluctuations. Navigation modules shifted mid-sequence. It was not trial, it was execution by stealth. And yet Kale endured. The deeper twist unfolded not within the trials, but within the observers. Among the hardened Draxian elite, a whisper of doubt began to surface. How could an off-worlder outmaneuver generational champions? How did a human unaugmented and uninvited adapt so quickly, so fluently to their most sacred gauntlet? Some scoffed. Others watched. A few began to wonder. And Arenya, standing above it all, began to realize the story was no longer about restoration. It was about recalibration. But the final trial awaited. The Labyrinth of Blood. A sprawling holographic construct overlaid with shifting physical barriers, misdirection fields, and genetically enhanced combatants trained in erratic, unpredictable strikes. The labyrinth wasn't meant to test combat readiness. It was meant to unmake the mind, destabilize the body, and fracture the will. Kale entered alone. The gates closed behind him with a thrum like a giant's heartbeat. Inside, the air felt wrong. Temperatures fluctuated violently. Audio sensors echoed phantom footsteps, and adversaries emerged from every shadow with unfamiliar movement patterns. Kale's breathing slowed, not in exhaustion, but in recalibration. He let instinct subside. He let awareness expand. His senses bent toward patterns in the chaos, the delayed pulses before wall, shifts the audible clicks before phase, resets the two smooth floor segments, hiding kinetic traps. He turned the randomness into a rhythm. He moved like water around rock. Outside the simulation, Thorn grew restless. He activated override sequences designed to misfire Kale's tracking sensors. He introduced scent-based confusion protocols designed to trigger nausea in human biology. He watched as Kale stumbled, momentarily bracing against a searing wall. But Kale did not fall. He recalibrated again, and then he ran. Through the final corridor, Kale emerged, not unscathed but unbroken. His armor burned in streaks, his shoulder dislocated and hastily reset, but his eyes clear. He crossed the threshold with a final lurch, and the labyrinth dissolved around him like a dream undone by will. The arena fell silent, and then the murmurs began. Not of protest, but of reevaluation. Arenya stood from her observation post. The gaze she cast upon Kale was not that of royalty appraising a warrior. It was of alignment of something deeper than strategy or law. She descended not with ceremonial fanfare, but with quiet inevitability. Every step she took rewrote doctrine in the eyes of those who watched. Back in the antechamber where wounds were bound and armor removed, Kale sat in half-darkness, sweat mingling with dried blood. Arenya entered, removing one armored gauntlet and then the other. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her proximity was permission. She approached her presence, a magnetic force, her expression unreadable. She stood before him, not as air or hybrid, but as being to being. Kale looked up, eyes heavy but undimmed. They both knew what had been risked, and what could no longer be denied. The moment that followed was not tenderness but clarity. When she reached for his face, fingers grazing the scar that crossed his jawline, it wasn't affection. It was identification, recognition. The touch that passed between them was not courtship, it was convergence. And somewhere deeper in the palace, machines recorded a shift in the succession paradigm. Data streams updated ancient protocols, and a law long dormant pulsed to life in quiet awakening. The Grand Council chamber was carved from obsidian veins laced with starlight ore, each column resonating faintly with the pressure of the galaxy's oldest political lineages. The air within was thicker than atmosphere weighted by centuries of tradition and held breath. Representatives from the Draxian provinces filled the elevated tiers, their crests rigid, their ceremonial garments imbued with holographic glyphs of ancestral triumph. At the chamber's center stood Lord Merrick Thorn, his armor flawless, his voice calibrated to command. His announcement sliced the silence with surgical calculation. He would invoke the right of supersession. Princess Arenya Varel, lacking a suitable match of uncontested genetic purity, would forfeit her claim to the throne. There was no precedent for reversal, only elimination. But Merrick had miscalculated. Before the echo of his final syllable faded, a new presence filled the chamber. Kale Riven stepped forward from the shadows, still bearing the marks of every trial, his posture fluid with defiance. He carried no banner, no crest, only the truth of what he had endured. The chamber erupted, shouts of sacrilege, outrage, the assertion that a human could not stand as consort, let alone contender. But their objections faltered against an older voice, one that emerged from the archives carried by a senior elder, whose voice cracked only slightly as he invoked the ancient clause. A candidate of proven valor, regardless of species, could legally stand if endorsed by the royal heir. And Kyle had passed the trials. Every one of them. The silence that followed was not acquiescence. It was surrender. Orenya moved to stand beside him. The synchronization of their stride, the unity of their presence said more than any declaration. They were no longer anomalies. They were force. They were reckoning. She confirmed her acceptance of Kael as her champion and potential consort, and the room fractured along invisible lines. Some leaned forward with newfound reverence. Others recoiled with disgust, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The political tide began to shift in whispers. Thorn acted swiftly, not with words but with contingency. Underneath the chamber, commands relayed through encrypted channels began to trigger emergency protocols. His private security forces mobilized, aiming to intercept and isolate the princess and her champion. But Orenya anticipated him. As the council recessed into disarray, she and Kyle disappeared into the subchambers of the palace, navigating routes only accessible through genetic imprint and old blood codes. There, beneath the foundation stones, they activated the broadcast failsafe Kale had installed during his escape, the full archive of Merrick Thorne's treason. Encrypted transfers linked to the shell corporations funding the assassination attempts. Modified blueprints of the trial constructs showing illegal alterations designed to kill. Audio logs of private conversations digitally confirmed, revealing the orchestration of events stretching back cycles. Every secret, every lie, every betrayal now projected across every major terminal in the palace. The truth unraveled in light. The consequences were immediate. Elite guard units, once loyal to the Dominion's ceremonial hierarchy, hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. Others turned on their own. The schism spread like plasma across ancient stone. Kael and Orenya moved as a unit through the chaos, weaving through collapsed corridors and flickering security gates, dispatching those who resisted, not with cruelty, but precision. Their rhythm was perfect. One moved, the other covered. One deflected, the other struck. Their bond, forged in blood and strategy, was undeniable. The corridor outside the central command vault became their battlefield. Thorne's loyalists, now desperate, launched coordinated assaults with precision drone squads and biomechanical enforcers. Orenya moved like a storm made flesh, her spinal cord pulsing in sync with her every strike, her blade an extension of will. Kyle flowed beside her, unpredictability incarnate, his motions built on the chaos of every war humanity had survived. Together, they rewrote what the council thought they understood about power. When the command vault finally fell to their advance, they found Thorne waiting. He stood flanked by two genetically amplified guards, his posture composed but his eyes laced with fury. He accused them of heresy, of poisoning the royal bloodline, of seducing the empire into decay. But the room no longer listened. The monitors around them, still broadcasting the truths Kale had exposed, muted his proclamations. The empire's eyes were elsewhere now. Still, he fought. The confrontation was swift and brutal. The guards moved first, modified for speed, strength, and resilience, but they were not prepared for harmony. Kyle and Orenya responded as one entity, not through rehearsed technique, but through mutual recognition. They moved not to survive, but to preserve something more. Kyle's unorthodox strikes disrupted the patterns the guards relied on. Orenya's precision dismantled their reinforced joints. When the last one fell, Thorne drew a weapon built for executions, a plasma spear with neural destabilizers. He charged. Orenya met him mid-strike, not as cousin, but as judgment incarnate. Her blade drove through the false calm he wore like armor, and he fell not with honor, but with silence. The chamber still burned as they stood over his body, their breathing synchronized, their wounds layered but inconsequential. In the council chamber above, the remaining elders called for reassembly. Orenya and Kale emerged not in triumph, but in transformation. They did not demand acknowledgement, they brought it with them. The elders reviewed the evidence, debated the consequences, and weighed the cost of resisting a future that had already arrived. One by one, they conceded. Not to Orenya's title, not to Kyle's survival, but to the truth they could no longer deny. The succession protocols were amended. Purity no longer held dominion over proof. Legacy no longer silenced resilience. The union of warrior and outsider, of sovereign and survivor, would mark the beginning of a new doctrine. One born not in ceremony, but in fire. In the quiet that followed after the declarations and revisions, Kael and Aurenya stood alone beneath the shattered dome of the high tower. The stars above no longer seemed distant. Their hands, when they found each other, were not tentative. They were inevitable. Twilight bled into the upper atmosphere of Zephyrian Prime, painting the sky in fractured shades of violet and flame. The palace stood transformed not by new walls or repaired spires, but by the silence within an expectant hush that carried not judgment, but potential. Across the capital, broadcasts from the High Council's final decree rippled through every tier of the Draxian dominion. The laws had been rewritten. For the first time in recorded memory, the Codex no longer dictated lineage by blood alone, but by action, by endurance, by truth. Kael Riven and Aurenya Varel stood side by side atop the ceremonial balcony overlooking the central plaza. Below them, a mixture of nobles, military veterans, scientists, and common-born citizens filled the square. The crowd did not cheer. They watched, measured, processing. Their traditions had not simply shifted, they had fractured. But cracks, Kael thought, were often where light entered first. The announcement that followed was brief. Aurenya was to ascend as sovereign under the new code. Kael, as her consort by merit of the trials, would not bear title or crest, but would serve as co-strategist of the Dominion's Outer Systems Alliance. There would be no coronation, no spectacle, only function, and from that function, a different future. Yet beneath the surface of protocol and proclamation, something deeper stirred. In the weeks that followed, internal resistance flickered but did not ignite. Traditionalists issued statements of discontent. A few houses withdrew their planetary funding networks, but the system held. It adapted. The younger ranks of Draxian academies submitted requests to study the new combat sequences Kael had introduced. Diplomatic envoys began to draft outreach strategies to human colonies once ignored. The term hybrid doctrine entered military lexicons. Within the palace itself, Kael and Aurenya resumed their training regimen not out of necessity but continuity. Their mornings began in silence, broken only by the clack of alloy on alloy, the hiss of breath against focus, the flicker of heat between bodies whose trust had surpassed species. No longer needing to prove anything, they fought as one to remain sharp alive, prepared for the weight of their decision. But one evening changed the axis of that silence. It began with a biometric fluctuation in Aurenya's spinal readings, an irregularity, then a cascade of hormonal signatures previously dormant. She ran additional scans. Kael stood at her shoulder, interpreting the patterns alongside her, each pulse of data aligning with a sequence he recognized not from combat, but from biology. The results came together slowly, undeniably. The hybrid resonance between them, forged in ritual combat and proximity, had triggered a spontaneous synchronization at the genetic level, not merely compatibility. Genesis. Their bond had initiated a sequence that neither species had considered biologically viable. The diagnostics confirmed it with clarity neither could dispute. Aurenya was carrying new life, not a union of anomaly, but the birth of a new template. The implications shattered the theoretical ceilings of both Draxian and human understanding. The child, if carried to term, would possess the neurological elasticity of humans and the skeletal cybernetic interface of Draxian physiology. No simulation had accounted for it. No historical precedent prepared them for it. It was not prophecy, it was evolution. And with it came danger. Security channels intercepted whispers of factions coalescing on fringe worlds denouncing the birth as heresy. Some sought to extract the unborn child for experimentation, others to terminate it as abomination. The palace prepared for siege without declaration. Protocols were reactivated. Trust reevaluated. But this time the war would not come from within the walls. It would arrive from beyond the stars. Kael and Aurenya responded not by hiding, but by building. They converted the old vault chambers into a defensive intelligence core. They redesigned training cycles to include neural adaptation strategies. They built allies from former rivals. They made ready not for a battle over succession, but for a battle over the right to redefine life itself. When the first fleet appeared at the edge of Zephyrian's orbit, unregistered and hostile, the child within Aurenya stirred for the first time. Her systems pulsed in harmony with something not yet born. Kael felt it too, a shift in perception, a widening of instinct. It was no longer defense, it was communion. Every movement they made on the battlefield that followed felt not like coordination but prophecy fulfilled in real time. In the aftermath, no enemy fleet remained, only echoes. Months passed, then cycles. The child grew not accelerated but radiant. Their very existence reframed how science defined inheritance, how philosophy approached synthesis, how entire civilizations considered identity. What was once shame became signal. What had been hidden became hope. And still Kael and Aurenya moved as they always had beside one another, unbroken by perception, unwavered by history. In time, statues would be raised, not of conquest, but of convergence. In time, scholars would debate whether their love had been the cause or the effect of a new era. But in truth, it was neither. It was just the beginning. What began as a contract became a revolution. What began as a duty became devotion. In the story of Kael Riven and Aurenya Virel, we witness not just the collapse of tradition, but the rise of something deeper, a redefinition of worth beyond species, beyond blood, beyond code. In a world where biology and belief once bound the future in chains, they chose to break them. Together they forged a future not from purity, but from possibility. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or imagine, consider subscribing to support more cinematic sci-fi storytelling like this. Drop a comment below about what moment hit you the hardest, and what you'd do in a world where love could rewrite evolution. Until next time, may your battles be worthy and your bonds unbreakable.